Hello and welcome to the KubeBuilder Controller Runtime and Controller Tools meeting for Thursday, September 10th, 2020. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be eventually posted to YouTube, so don't say anything that you don't want written down in the annals of internet history. All right, so let's see. I think we have two items on the agenda now. I think the first one is from Camilla and Gabby. So do either of you want to take it away?
Hi there. Camila, do you want to get started, or I'm happy to introduce as well?
Let's go. You can go, Gabby.
Are you sure? Thank you. So Camila and I were talking yesterday about just formalizing a bug triage process for KubeBuilder, because like she brought up that there are about like almost 20 outstanding bugs that we would like to carve time out to investigate. So our plan was to just come up with another bi-weekly meeting that would probably be shorter than this one, about 30 minutes, in which we would just triage and assign bug issues to folks to investigate.
Yeah, I just would like to say one thing. Gabby and I was chatting. This is like Camila, community contributor. I doesn't know the opinion of the team that I work in the Red Hat, just to highlight, it's not something from the team. It's just me personal, as person.
I think a triage meeting sounds like a reasonable idea. I definitely think we could give it a try at the very least for a couple of meetings. I think these tend to depend on like how much people actually end up following through on them. But I think having a triage meeting would be a good idea to try. Definitely.
Yeah, I would love to see if it helps us address the backlog.
Yeah, I think it's our baby, and we need maybe we can organize better the milestones and things like that. To know when we need to do the release and this stuff. Just came from the motivation.
We've been doing triage meetings in 6CLI. Eddie Zainski has been running those, and it's been pretty successful, at least at having discussions around the topics and making sure that they are at least responded to. My big takeaway is it requires like a lot of work on Eddie's part to like prepare for the meeting to the extent where they kind of have a plan to go through and moderate and make sure every 2 weeks. We do one every other week. But if you could probably reach out to Eddie too and ask them if they have any tips.
Gabby and I are very motivated, and we volunteer for at least to start. Maybe others can help after as well, if they wish. Maybe we can find more people from the community engaged too. So maybe it is motivated them to work in the project.
I think we now, I don't know if you all saw, but I think we now have official like needs triaged labels and stuff that the project as a whole is going to be using, and possibly something that's auto assigning them that we could turn on. So that might at least help with keeping track of things. I think there was some discussion on the mailing list if y'all didn't see it.
Sure, I will give a look. I didn't.
Sorry, for clarification, the mailing list I think was the Kubernetes mailing list, I think is where I saw that. The Kubernetes dev one. So there's a lot of mailing lists in this project. I should probably be specific. All right. Does anybody else have any input they would like to add, or Camilla or Gabby, do you have anything else you want to add here?
I don't have anything else.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you for the support, folks. Let's see.
of course. All right. I think Phil has a cool project that he's been working on now that he wanted to talk about briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Solly. I put some links in there. I'd share my screen, but I'm tethering right now because of internet challenges at home. But the idea is looking at the API. There's the API Server Builder project that was started some time ago and was the kind of precursor to KubeBuilder, and it does a lot of ideas that were developed before kind of the experience of controller runtime, and relies a lot on code generation and these sorts of things. And I've been exploring if those ideas were really necessary or if we could apply the ideas in KubeBuilder in controller runtime. And I think I've been relatively successful. You can open up the sample link. The second one will bring you to kind of the main program of what this looks like for a sample. And it follows the controller runtime builder pattern, for instance, of adding resources and these sorts of things. The motivations for this, there's basically three high-level ones that I think are interesting wins that aren't addressed by CRDs, the CRDs and the KubeBuilder libraries as they stand today. One is if you want to create a virtual API that doesn't have storage and you really just want a REST interface, I think that we already have some of these in the Kubernetes project where the events may not be. I'm not sure if it's events or something else. Solly probably knows, but there's at least one where. What was that?
It's metrics.
Metrics. Thank you. There it is. Events use a different etcd instance or something. Yeah. So like metrics would be an example of this. A second in related piece would be maybe you want to store something, but etcd isn't the right storage because of the size limits of the values, or because maybe you want better indexing, or you want a managed service, so you want to use just like a Postgres compatible API or something like that you could just spin up on a different cloud provider. And so that would give you different properties, but still the ability to create a Kubernetes API, and CRD wouldn't really support that case well. And then the third case is around creating arbitrary sub-resources. I know that the Kubernetes, the CRDs are looking at different sub-resource support, and so that may be available in CRDs at some point in time. But the API server aggregation definitely supports it now, and those don't necessarily require storage. So you may have a sub-resource for something that's really just modifying an object stored through a CRD or something. So that would be a fun way of doing that. And then I guess the fourth thing I haven't really listed here is that besides if you take out the etcd storage piece, but if you're looking at the complexity of building a CRD with maybe a validating webhook and a mutating webhook for defaulting, and then type conversion, so you have conversion webhooks, and so you're stitching together like a lot of different potentially stitching together like a lot of different services and webhooks and configuration, and that it could be simpler just to implement the Go interfaces if you're writing in Go anyway, because you're not spinning up quite as many services and you're not giving patches back, for instance, and these sorts of things. So that's the motivation behind this. The implementation is really, I just forked the sample API server that demonstrates API server aggregation. And I put in a couple lines of hooks. So there's a couple areas where there's a code specific to the types in there, and so I replaced those with essentially variables that you can add to, like maps that has the APIs instead of hard coding the APIs. So there's really just a couple places where that was necessary. And then in addition to that, I built a porcelain library that then exposes a bunch of niceties around how to register into those. Like for instance, one thing it does is it makes heavy use of interfaces for types. So you can implement, instead of like defining a strategy with the namespace or something like that, you just implement an interface on the types. And so then the porcelain will go and automatically configure the API server accordingly. So I guess what I'm asking or bringing this to this meeting for is if there's interest from the group to host this as part of a KubeBuilder sub-project, would we want to put this, like have a repo for this? If not, there's interest in the API server builder sub-project to host it there. So that would be a possibility. But I think if we see this being more widely used, or if there's interest from the KubeBuilder community in adding this to the list of tools, then KubeBuilder would probably be a better place for that repo.
For what it's worth, although it hasn't traditionally been a particularly close collaboration, API Server Builder is kind of under the auspices of KubeBuilder from the Kubernetes organizational standpoint. For historical context, and for anyone who isn't super familiar with the kind of org structure of our sub-project, so KubeBuilder is under the sub-project called the Server SDK sub-project of SIG API Machinery. The kind of most active parts of this are, I believe, the KubeBuilder projects, and I think API Server Builder is still alpha is still being maintained. And then there's also like the sample API server and sample controller repos, which demonstrate like if you are writing from scratch, how you might write a controller or an aggregated API server. So technically it's already kind of part of, and I think it would be awesome to have more close collaboration between those two, and I think this would be a really neat way to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that correction, Sally. I believe you are right on that. Yeah, the hope is that the API server builder, or sorry, yeah, the API server builder could, for instance, swap out all of its code generation for this approach, and then become a much simpler project. And if this was done as part of, I guess, Sally, are you thinking that regardless, if a Kubernetes, if the server SDK wanted this, it would probably be under KubeBuilder, regardless of whether it's, you know, more closely tied to the API server builder portion of it or the controller runtime portion of it?
Yeah, I think it like, since this is like kind of the KubeBuilder approach to aggregated API server development, I think it makes sense for it to kind of be under the auspices of KubeBuilder. I think that kind of makes sense. I don't know, what do other people think?
What about if we put a design doc with an example over how to solve what kind of problems could be solved with this approach. How do you know the users would use this with a KubeBuilder? Maybe would be easier to get its advantage. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Would a GoDoc? I've been mainly working through GoDocs on this. If I put a pretty thorough doc.go page together, would that kind of address what you're asking about?
Yeah, I think in the KubeBuilder has a design doc, but anything, because at least for me sometimes the ideas is a little bit abstract. You know, I can get the goal, but I'm not sure if I understood what 100% your motivations. You know, and how you think that the users would use that with the tool. Maybe would you clarify for me and for the others as well? I usually understand better when I see the code. So
Yeah, why don't
yeah.
why don't we try this? I'm going to try to share my screen, and then we're gonna see if the bandwidth deities are are being kind today. Just one second here.
So kind of to clarify, Phil, did you have a particular preference on like you'd rather have it in like controller runtime subdirectory or like an experimental branch or something like that versus putting it as like version 2 of API Server Builder?
You mean like, oh yeah, like put it under a control its own. So I think what you're asking is like there's a couple routes we could go. One is put it as part of an existing like controller runtime repo as a new package. Another is put it as its own repo, like as a sibling of controller runtime. And then a third is put it in part of the API Server Builder repo as a like a new major version. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, my question is like, did you have a preference for one of those three?
I don't have I wouldn't have a preference. Like, I guess I should say, I suspect the thing that seems cleanest to me is its own repo, like a sibling of controller runtime. It's I know that people are using API Server Builder, and doing a major version with a branch in there, I think might be more challenging, especially since there's the name of maybe because like I can like we have KubeBuilder and controller runtime, and so I think of this as like the controller runtime equivalent, of which API Server Builder doesn't have one. So even if we were to do a version 2 mirroring that structure, I think would still make sense to me. I don't have any objection to putting it as part of like controller runtime if you had a preference for that. I probably would lean against it simply because I wouldn't want to, I know that the controller runtime is a more mature, right, and it's versioned. Like people have come to expect certain things about maybe its versioning, and if we put this as its own repo, we can version it as like 010, and then people understand the level of maturity to expect.
Okay, I think we're kind of on the same page. I think those are good arguments. I think a separate repo, maybe API Server Runtime, makes sense.
Yes, that's exactly what it's named now. So that was my initial thought as well. So Camilla, or just any other thoughts there, Sally, or should I show the code a little briefly here?
Go
Or do we
ahead
have
and
time?
give we have time for a brief code demo. Go ahead.
All right, I'll go through just real quickly here. So here's like the main page, if you're able to see it. This would be like what your main looks like. You can see lines 32 to 37 look familiar with the controller runtime builder. And it has a similar approach where we register, instances of the types, and then it does kind of the auto registration for you. This one, there's a couple different ways I've been looking at this. This is kind of the simplest, what I'm trying to demo here, but there are more powerful and flexible ways. It's much like controller runtime, it's built on layers. In this case, what I've done, you can see the types here. I've made the option to put a lot of the logic directly on the type, so it looks more like a Rails application or your typical REST service building approach. This is not required. It's just, and you can always split this out later. So it's not a hard decision, but I think it gives a nice, simple demo, and it's easy to understand as your first step. This should look familiar. In this case, this is a implementation without storage. So this just implements a REST endpoint. It would be more like the metrics server that Solly described. And so in this case, it just has a value. This API, what it does is it runs the fortune command and then prints out a fortune for you. And then if you give it a name, you get a name fortune, then it will find a fortune that has that string as part of the fortune. And if you do a list, you'll get a list of fortunes. So rather than, while you can still continue to do the way the API server works by default, in this case, we've decided to just register, implement these interfaces, the storage interfaces directly on the type. Again, this wouldn't work as well if you wanted to export these types as a API, but if you're building just your own API for usage, this may be a good way to go. So there's this convert to table that does the printing, for instance. And so it automatically, when you call kube get, it will make sure that this gets invoked. And it implements list, right? So this, rather than registering at CD storage, this gets invoked. Same thing with get. So whatever functions you happen to implement get invoked. You can see here doing the fortune exec, for instance. And then it implements these other functions to just make it so that instead of having to wire them from other pieces of the code, you can, the type itself knows all the data required to expose its endpoint. So for instance, rather than like passing in explicitly, here's a new instance function for this thing, like the object itself knows how to create a new one. So just by passing in an instance, it knows how to register both the new and new list functions it would give to the storage. And same thing with namespace scoped. It just, instead of having to put this as part of a strategy, you do it here. One thing we've done is gotten rid of the internal versions. So instead of having a hub that's like its own internal version, in the vast majority of cases, like one of the external versions would have been totally sufficient and actually would solve a lot of issues where like libraries work against the internal version, but other folks want to use those libraries and now they can't use those libraries because they're internal, right? And so by just using an external version everywhere and just picking one of the external versions as the hub, that problem goes away. So this is saying that it's a storage version to use this as the hub. If you don't, you either implement this or you implement another function, which is the conversion function, and the conversion function will convert back and forth between the version, storage version. You get the object metadata. This is used by, there's a lot of places where otherwise they're hard-coded, like just getting the object metadata and taking out the labels or something. So rather than hard-coding the type to get the object meta, we just implement an interface. Same thing here. This tells us where to register it. So this is how the machinery is able to register it. So that's like a more complicated type that implements its own sort of REST thing. Here's like kind of the ones from the sample API server, what they look like. So these are much simpler. This just takes regular storage. And but instead of having to implement strategies and all this strategies and REST stuff, you just implement these 6 functions about how to get a new list object, how to get a new object, whether it's a namespace scoped, whether we should use this as the hub, get the object metadata. And actually this one's optional. You don't even need to implement that one. Looking a little deeper, I'm going to switch sharing tabs here quickly. All right. This is done. Most of the logic is in this builder package. And so the builder implements a bunch of different stuff. Like, so I just showed you the with resource, but if you really want to have the strategy as a separate thing, there's like a with resource and strategy. So you can decouple those, or there's with resource and handler, which is effectively the storage. But I've called it handler because I think the users will think of it as a REST handler, and it doesn't necessarily store an object. And then there's with resource and storage, and that does this. That changes actually the generic storage rather than, so it uses a storage function. There's also sub resources for registering. So you'd register the parent and then the path and then the request object. And then strategy and handler look pretty much the similar there. And then there's a number of different options for doing deep customizations, right? So you can swap, you can modify the server options or the generic API server just in time before those are built. And you can add additional schemas and different installers into those schemas. By default, we try and do clever stuff, right? Like, so again, looking at kind of the way the interfaces work, right? If you implement a defaulting function on the type, instead of us making you register it with the scheme as kind of boilerplate code that you copy and paste, when we register that resource, we just check, are you a default? Do you implement defaulting? Okay, yes. Let's just register your defaulting function for yourself. So that's a quick code walkthrough. Is that helpful or give context, more context?
Yes, it is really nice.
Thanks for the demo and the walkthrough, Phil.
Yeah, my pleasure. If I was more prepared, I'd actually give a real demo about running, but maybe I can do that another week.
Sure. Does anybody have any thoughts that they'd like to add or anything else they want to talk about? Doesn't sound like it. In that case, I'll see y'all either in a couple weeks or when we figure out, if we figure out the triage meeting and we schedule that for next week. I'll see you then.
Wait,
You have
there was one more item on
item.
the.
Oh, there is one more item? I missed that.
Yeah,
What's
sorry.
the...
I thought you meant, is there anything else to talk about that particular agenda item beforehand?
Okay. I apologize for missing that. When I last checked, it wasn't there, so.
No, you're fine. Yeah, so I have a PR up for adding V1 webhook and CRD support to KubeBuilder. I just want to make that known for anybody who's thinking about making the switch themselves for their controller projects. And I want to discuss here some of the UX around leaving V1 Beta 1 support in KubeBuilder. So a little backstory for those who don't know. Kubernetes 1.19 will be deprecating, or has deprecated now that it's released, V1 Beta 1 CRDs, and V1 Beta 1 webhook configs have been deprecated since 1.16. So it's a prime time to just switch over to these things by default. There were a few dependencies that needed to be worked on, like controller generating V1 webhooks. And yeah, so now that those dependencies have been resolved, this PR can move forward. But we also probably should continue to support scaffolding, patches, and customized configs for V1 Beta 1 webhooks and CRDs. I guess the problem is now that assuming that we want to support both, we need to figure out, like, do we want to accept, or do you want to allow users to generate both for a project, so they can have one controller project for an older or I guess a new controller project that supports older and newer cluster versions, or do we want to just allow scaffolding one version or the other, or just and this, I guess, the most restrictive case that I don't think we want to do, but I'll put it out there anyway, only allow v1 webhooks and CRDs to be scaffolded, and then we don't have to worry about any of the UX. It's just done for us. And that's basically what we have right now, but for v1 beta 1. So are there any thoughts on this? I guess I'll also say that the way it's done right now is kind of option 2, where you can choose between v1 or v1 beta 1 for both webhooks and CRDs, and that choice is available through flags on all 3 or all 2 creation commands and init. And the reason that there are so many flags on so many commands is that there are several pieces of code in the init commands that require a choice between those 2 versions, and in create API, obviously we're creating CRD patches and customizations, so that choice needs to be made for CRDs, and then for webhooks, same thing.
We should probably store that in the project file so that you don't have to specify it the same, if we're going to go with that approach, so that you don't have to specify it multiple times.
That is something that I thought about. Do you have, like, off the top of your head right now, do you have an idea of like where you would want to see that stored?
Probably in like the resource information section, but I don't really have much. I don't really have a super strong opinion off the top of my head, but that is the, like, kind of the oh, we have this flag value that must match between 3 different commands is like one of the prime use cases for why we have the project files.
Right. So if we don't, so that would kind of imply that we're asking on create API, right?
Yeah.
Right. So we also need to store webhook version information, and I don't necessarily know if that, like, would we store both the CRD version and the webhook version in the resource?
I mean, I think that seems like probably a reasonable approach. As a brief aside, I think it would be nice potentially to be able to have multiple version support, but that might be A, might be fairly complicated, and B, we might be hitting like the limits of how complex a customized config set any given human can like actually wrap their brain around.
Yeah, I was playing with it a bit, and it's not fun. The internal logic is a little bit complex to implement, and I don't want to make things too complex, because then it becomes unmaintainable. I will say that if you just put all v1 beta 1 stuff like in a subdirectory of where it normally goes in config, so if you, for example, like for v1 patches, you'd have config CRD patches. And then for V1 beta 1 patches, you'd have config CRD V1 beta 1 patches. And then you'd also put a separate customization.yaml in that V1 beta 1 folder. So you basically just separate everything out. And then if you want to change or your default config/default, for example, then you would just add that subdirectory to each one of your like resource paths. And there you go. You've got that covered. Or if you want to just copy the default directory and make a separate one for V1 beta 1, then you would basically do the same thing.
So just to see if I got your idea, it's like the multi-group stuff. You have a flag and we allow, okay, please allow both version. And then if this flag be true, we have two paths, new paths for the APIs. One for each version. Is that more or less the idea?
Kind of. So if I'm understanding you right, I think you're asking if there are going to be like a V1 and a V1 beta 1 path, or just two different ones.
Yeah, it's like now we have the multi-groups. We have a simple path without the group. When we scaffold an API and it has not multi-group support, the path has not the name, we don't have a director with the name of the group. If we have just one kind of version for the CRD API, we don't need a director with the versions in the same way. So I doesn't know if it was your idea already, but to do something like the same. If I want a complex configuration where I want both V1 and beta V1 have a multi-version support equals true in the project file, and then we start to scaffold the things different. Otherwise, by default,
that is not what I was thinking, because it would be nice to preserve the current directory structure no matter what happens. So the top level manifests will always be your like primary version that you care about, whether it's V1 or V1 beta 1. And then you'll have a subdirectory that you can use as your secondary one. But I mean, I'm open to both options. It's just the multi-group situation is quite complicated because you are completely changing the project structure rather than adding onto it. So I wanted to avoid that as much as possible.
I just to completely throw a wrench in things, I have kind of a leading suggestion or a comment, which is to say, it at some point in the future, doesn't have to be now, we may want to consider whether or not customize is still appropriate for what we're trying to do, and whether or not like we're just making things a lot harder for ourselves or a lot harder for users to read, versus something else.
I second that actually. I've been exploring as part of the API server runtime some alternatives, and writing a program that generates the configuration actually turns out to be a relatively clean solution, I think.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I also know people have like explored tooling around like writing like, here's the program and then here's it can still apply some additional patches if you need to apply patches to the output or something like that. So we could think about doing something like that. That might simplify our lives, and it might end up actually simplifying users' lives, because right now the customized directory is kind of an impenetrable mess. I mean that in the nicest way possible, but like, I don't expect the average KubeBuilder user to actually understand why there's like 15 different customized patches going on there, and how they get applied.
I have a bit of a foot in the configuration side, and so I could give a technical talk or on some of the approaches that are probably going to be better fits if anyone's interested. I don't know if you'd want to do that as like a separate meeting.
I think that would be, I don't know, I think that would be wonderful. I think we could either do that next meeting, or we could schedule a separate sub meeting depending on meeting fatigue and how excited people are, and they just really want to do it next week versus waiting a couple weeks or something.
Yeah, I'd be interested in attending whenever, whether it's next week or next month.
I think it would be nice to be soon, because the release of the Kubernetes will be very soon. So
All right, I'd be happy to do it next week before the community meeting.
What time would that be? At 10? No,
That'd be at 9. This the same time as this one.
okay.
what day?
What was that?
What is the date?
The 17th.
Okay.
So it would be Thursday, like basically the same time slot, just on one of our off weeks.
Oh, I see.
So it's great for me. It's okay for you. I would like to attend as well. It's okay for you, Eric, this time.
If you want to put a poll, just a quick one to get some times down, the Kubernetes or KubeBuilder Slack channel, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm notoriously bad at any sort of coordination, as Solly can tell you from many experiences seeing me flail. But if someone else would put a poll together, I would be happy to participate.
Yeah. Do we have a volunteer to just put together a timing poll quickly? If not, I can try to do it a little bit later.
In the KubeBuilder channel.
Yeah, if someone is already just like, I can do that right now, that would be great. Otherwise,
what's the name of the site that we usually use for that? I forget what it's called.
Doodle, I think.
Oh, Doodle, yeah. If someone just wants to put together a doodle and then post it in the KubeBuilder window and then manage it and make the final call on which time, that would be ideal.
We have like one meeting after that, but if it's okay, be today after, I can do.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I just cannot do now. Now I cannot.
That's totally fine.
Okay.
Quickly, how does that potential future decision affect what we're talking about right now?
My thought is that maybe if we decide to do that and it ends up being not too much work, that might simplify having a multi supporting older versions. I think maybe if it's not too much work, maybe put together a little like prototype PR that shows what you meant with the multiple directories for versions or something like that. we can see how complicated that is, but I think maybe loosely proceed under the intention that for now, probably the easiest thing is just to choose one or the other.
Yeah, and yeah, so that's exactly what exists right now. The other, so I had two other things I wanted to bring up related to this. One, related to what you were just saying about adding the versions on a resource basis. You also need to specify these versions during init, because you need to configure the makefile. And then one other thing that I'm not able to think of right now. So that would be like a project-wide configuration.
Okay, well, I think maybe it makes sense to just put it as a project-wide configuration in the project file instead. Then we could add it.
That makes the most sense to me, because I don't see why you would have like one resource have both versions and then another resource have one version, unless you're doing a migration, maybe.
That makes sense. I think
Okay.
that's.
And then the third one, or I guess the second one, what I was saying, is that I started to like write some end-to-end tests and code generation tests for this stuff, and came to the realization that because we have two different plugin versions with two different controller gen versions, it's really difficult to write tests in the current test suite that don't have version conflicts between the binaries in your Go bin. And so I've had to do a bunch of work around that. And I think that I'm almost there, but obviously the tests aren't passing because of that right now. So I need to go back and fix some things. And I've noticed that in some parts of the code that we just straight up remove the binaries from the path to get around this issue. And like, I'm not happy about doing that, but if it solves things much more easily, then I actually can't even think of what we can do to solve it without drastically changing how we install controller gen and customize. Then I'm fine doing that as well. I was wondering if anybody had any opinions on that.
Yeah, I think for existing project structures, especially the ones where we don't explicitly have like an escape hatch for like like installing controller gen into like a tools module or something, I think we might just have to continue doing that kind of hacky, like make sure things aren't on the path, or like make sure the version we want is the last thing on the path for that test or something like that. I think maybe in the future, making sure we have like an escape hatch in all of our versions for like just installing controller gen and like a separate submodule or something for tools is a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll continue just doing what everything else is doing right now and just remove it from the path. And I think there's an issue open for the controller gen lifecycle discussion. So maybe we can follow up there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That sounds good to me. And that's it for my agenda item.
All right. Does anybody else have anything, or is there anything that got added last minute to the agenda since the last time I checked it, like 10 minutes ago? Or was that the last item? Me.
I think that was the last one.
All right. I think with that, we're just about at 10 anyway, so I think that's perfect timing. I'll see y'all at some point next week probably for the talk by Phil about configuration.
Sounds good. See ya.
See ya.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sally.
Full
Especially
day.
thanks, Sally.
Thanks.
Of course. Stay safe.
Thank you.